professor and chairman of the history department at Sam Houston University. His book, Iconoclasts, The Rebels Who Sparked the Supply-Side Revolution and Restored American Prosperity. He writes a weekly column for Forbes.com under the byline, Past and Present. Professor, welcome back.
It's great to be here, Grant.
Lot to get to, so let's just jump right in. Here is the former labor secretary for Bill Clinton speaking to the issue of spreading the wealth and prosperity. What is interesting here is that Robert Reich is being asked by former Congressman Harold Ford Jr. about improving the economy. And here is the presentation and the answer, the question and the answer. Roll it.
Sanctions that were imposed after the Russian takeover of the Crimea.
That would be John Bolton, of course. And John Bolton is not that particular guest, as we were speaking of. This would be, the clip would be number 8, clip 8, and it would be Robert Reich. Roll it.
Should we be employing to increase the purchasing power of the middle class, to improve mobility in the country, which clearly has suffered as a result of technology changes and other things as well? So
well, I think we've got to expand the earned income tax credit. And every time you use those words, everybody's eyes glaze over, but it's a terribly important program that is a wage subsidy for people who are low income. If you do those two, that is raise the minimum wage, expand the earned income tax credit, you are getting at least some purchase on the problem. But I think going back to Stephanie's point, we've also got to spread ownership. You know, George W. Bush and others have talked about the ownership society. Well, we really do have to spread seriously ownership, because if most of the gains are coming from stock rate gains, you know, the whole country ought to be part of that.
So, Professor, is it possible to spread the wealth? And is that government's role? And if so, what is the impact when government does that?
Well, it's funny. Robert Reich and a lot of people on the left wing of the Democratic Party argue that anytime there's an inequality problem, it must have been caused by business in the private sector. To the extent that we do have an inequality problem, it was, of course, caused by government. I mean, the reason one needs to invest in the stock market and have hedge funds and all that stuff is that the Federal Reserve has overprinted the dollar and completely mispriced assets in this country. The best thing the government could do to ensure that the lower classes, the working classes, are able to save money and become more affluent is to stabilize the value of the dollar, because then working class people could simply save money and they would have it in the future. But they can't do that now because the Federal Reserve wants to undermine the value of the currency.
Speaking of the Federal Reserve, Fed Chair Janet Yellen answering questions and addressing the concerns over a prolonged, lackluster recovery, in the sense that we stayed in the economic downturn that we are in and we face those headwinds, and what we can do about it, what the Fed can do about it specifically, and that's what you're talking about. Here she was testifying today. Roll it.
Crisis, I think, left us with a lot of headwinds that the economy has been struggling to overcome. So we have indeed had a disappointingly slow recovery, and our consistent expectations for a pickup in growth have been dashed over a number of years. You asked what role can the Federal Reserve play, and it is, as I emphasized, to continue to use monetary policy and to adjust it in light of changing economic circumstances, as we have over all these years during the recovery, to foster healing of the labor market, a return to so-called full employment. And I think that's the best contribution that we can make. You asked me also what role the public and private sector can play. I think almost on anybody's list of what the private and public sector can do to address those disturbing trends would be greater training and education. And clearly there's a great deal that the public can do. And also I see state and local governments and private individuals, obviously, in making their own decisions about training are responding to those differentials in ways that I think will be helpful over time.
Okay, now that was at the New York Economic Club, not testifying, just a Q&A, a speech and a Q&A. But here's my question. She seemed to recognize that things haven't worked. So do you see in that she's looking to change course?
That was an amazing exercise in buck passing that Janet Yellen put before the Economic Club of New York. By the way, where John F. Kennedy in 1962 proposed his tax cut, she should have taken his example. Here's what she said. The financial crisis left the economy with headwinds. She's blaming the private sector, and by the way, headwinds is one of Ben Bernanke's favorite words. So the private sector gave us this crisis that's lingering, and now, to her other language, what can the Federal Reserve do to help? So her narrative sequence is the private sector gave us this crisis. We had nothing to do with it. We're on the sidelines. Anything we can do to help? All that is buck passing. It's a psychological projection. The Federal Reserve, in fact, caused the crisis and is the reason the crisis has lasted. And she's trying to project it onto someone else.
Okay, in that projection, she speaks to the private sector and what they can do to help and get us out of this. And I guess the language is really important here, Professor, because when we talk about we and let's help and the private and public partnerships, oh, those are dandy. We see that we've gone away from an economy based on individuals blessed with godly gifts, exercising their freedom to hopefully bless themselves, bless others, and provide and grow. And we've gotten into this kind of mix of the government and business working together, which inevitably yields less power for the individual, more power for a centrally planned economy. Your thoughts?
She knows that the Federal Reserve's interest on reserves policy, which is resulting in, $50 billion a year in interest to the financial companies from the Federal Reserve, is locking up all the capital in this country. And the reason they don't want to stop that policy is because if they did, then all that money would go out and feed inflation. The only solution is that proposed by Ronald Reagan in 1981 and enacted by Kennedy 20 years before that, and even Andrew Mellon before that. You have to have tax cuts. Tax cuts will draw that money out of the banking system and into the real economy, start to get real businesses going. Forget about all that education and training she was talking about. If you had a tax cut, you would draw all that money out. People would take advantage of it privately, just like you suggested, and this Great Recession would be ancient history.
So again, let's not talk about investments and education and training. Let's talk about liberating the individual. And you started with, hey, guess what? Business did not start this. It was the Fed, and it was also the Community Reinvestment Act, arguably on steroids, through the Clinton, through Bush, through, Clinton, and then through the years of Bush, though 17 communications from the White House about warning about the consequence of making banks lend less not based on the ability for the individuals to pay back the loan, but more on political outcomes. And I know that's a big part of it. But what you're saying is the answer keeps coming back to freedom, less government, let people keep their money, stop trying to say we're going to take it and then reinvest it for you. Oh, and also stop playing with the value of their money, which speaks to inflation, which Janet Yellen, Chairman Yellen, spoke to today. Roll it.
As the recovery proceeds and healing occurs, it's obvious that we will need to tighten monetary policy to avoid overshooting our target. And we're very focused on that. This is a judgment call that the Federal Reserve needs to make in every expansion. Overshooting that goal, we've learned in past episodes and past recoveries, be very costly to reverse. That's something we don't want to happen. And so, yes, we will remain very focused on removing accommodation when the right time has come. And I feel very confident that we have the tools to do that and also the commitment and will. And by making our objective of 2% longer run inflation very clear, we did that in order to be transparent and to give the public a way to hold us accountable for achieving that goal.
Professor, if you were to ask a follow-up question to that response, that statement, what would it be?
It would be, is it true that the Federal Reserve overshot the money supply when Ronald Reagan cut taxes in 1981? I mean, she implies that the Federal Reserve has every single example, and she said every one shows that the Federal Reserve can overshoot its target and there can be terrible consequences. Well, actually not when you cut taxes and cut regulation, because the demand for money from entrepreneurs is so incredible that you can actually not supply enough of it. That's when the gold price collapses, oil collapses, art prices fall, and everyone wants to get into real investments. Sorry, Janet Yellen, you can have a very expansive monetary policy if you get the government out of the tax code, out of the regulatory code, and let the economy roar.
What does it speak to? Something that struck me was the enormous power the Fed has. At the time, it can change direction and what that will do to the economy. What she's talking about inevitably is when to taper. What does that do to an economy that, from what I'm gathering, is not solid? And it's not solid because it doesn't have the fundamentals. It can you can keep going along this route, but the fundamentals aren't there. Your thoughts?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, why would you taper? If you think there's going to be an economic boom, you wouldn't taper. I mean, so that doesn't make any sense. So if you had pro-growth policies, like getting the government out of the private sector, you would expect a tremendous rush of investment into the private sector, which would be the opposite of tapering. One would think that the money supply would increase. So that's some kind of weird shell game that she's playing. Well, we might have to take our medicine. The government's always telling the private economy that it's going to have to take its medicine. And the reason is that means the private economy shrinks relative to government. And government's agenda, of course, is to maintain its relevance.
So, bottom line, we really won't see an economic recovery as we know it, unless, of course, we change the complete paradigm of the way we look at economic growth. And from what I gather, we're looking at a Keynesian-esque economic growth where the government says we've got to stimulate demand. Do they put the cart in front of the horse when it comes to demand and production?
Two things, Crane. First of all, the greatest success story in the entire history of world economic activity is the modern American economy, the American economy since the 19th century. So I am always going to place my bets on the American economy versus the government. If there's going to be a big contest between the private economy and the government, I will assume that the resources, the savvy, the intelligence, and the winning attitude are on the private sector side, no matter how competitive the government gets. So to answer the second point, well, yeah, government cooks up this kind of false distinction about we have to stimulate demand. What that does, of course, is lead to the economic torpor that we've seen the last 6 years, and lo and behold, the government gets to grow.
And so they can always keep pointing to that, and the way they stimulate demand is through greater intervention, more planning, and redistribution, as opposed to liberating and incentivizing production.
That doesn't make any sense. We're going to take money away from people who are investors, who are starting businesses, and who are hiring people, and we're going to pay excess reserve interest with it. I mean, it doesn't, it doesn't make any sense. And they tried this in the 1970s. I mean, that was the heyday of Keynesianism, and all it led to was an inflation and unemployment. We called it stagflation.
With the statistical manipulation that we've seen, hide the ball and changing the formulas, et cetera, you mentioned last time we were on talking about how long it took 15 years for the Reagan Revolution. Do you think we will see a major change in America? Will the revolution take that long? Are we going to see a second revolution, if you will?
Well, we've seen something very interesting the last few years. It's that government is actually so inept that it could not figure out how to keep spending. Let's remember the Obama stimulus proposal, $800 billion. And then after that expired, they actually did not have an agenda to spend more. They didn't know how to do it. And so the private sector starts growing a little more than government, a little more than government, while government spending actually fell. You have to remember, government is fundamentally dumb. I mean, the private sector is so much more intelligent than government that government won't even know how to take advantage of its greatest moment of opportunity. And I think that's what we're starting to see in this semi-recovery. The private sector is resurging a little bit, and government is asking, how can we stop that?
Professor Brian Domitrovic, the book Econoclast, how the rebels who sparked the supply side revolution and restored American prosperity. Check out his work.